loyalty, biography. And so without further ado, welcome back, George A. Bray. George.
Thanks, Sean. Hello, everyone, or good morning, I guess I'll say. Pleasure to be here. Pleased to see you all here. Some friends of mine are here, which is some of them surprised me, which was quite nice. I'm going to talk, as he said this morning, about Lord Howe, obviously, but before I do that, I want to thank John for the invitation, Vinny for all he did for accommodations, and it's really great to be back to do this. And I also want to thank one other person, that's my friend Randy Patton, who has provided this. Let me go to the, if it works, it did earlier. Is it not working now? Oh, there we go. We'll go to the first slide. Lord Howe was born in 1725. He was the eldest son of Emmanuel Scrap, who was the second Viscount Howe and a peer of Ireland. George, as John had said, was the oldest. So upon his father's death, at the age of 10, he became the third Viscount. And as John mentioned, of course, he had two brothers, William and Richard. Richard was the second eldest. William would be the third son. The two of them, of course, do gain prominence in the Revolutionary War. However, they also were prominent during the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Richard, the naval officer, he actually had engaged with the French, which was one of the things they claimed as the catalyst for the war, 7 Years' War later on. And then William was with another hero of mine, and has a lot in common with Howe, and that's James Wolfe. And he served with James Wolfe at Quebec, and he commanded the light infantry. And then all three of these brothers would all serve at one time or other in Parliament. And Nottingham was their locale that they represented. Now, he arrives in North America in June of 1757. He's at that time Colonel Commandant of the 3rd Battalion of the 60th Regiment of Foot, which was also known as the Royal American Regiment. He comes to Nova Scotia with Lord Loudon. They were going to have an expedition against Louisbourg. That expedition never actually got off the ground. They got to Halifax, and that was pretty much it until he comes back here. But by September, he's going to be appointed as Colonel of the 55th Foot after the death of its previous commander, Charles Perry, who actually died on the voyage to Halifax. And then in December, he would be appointed as Brigadier General, second in command of Abercrombie's army, destined to go against Fort Ticonderoga. And come on, there we go. So here's a list of his promotions. I have the former ones I mentioned toward the bottom, but he started off his career at the age of 20 as an ensign in the 1st Foot Guards in 1745. 2 years later, he'd be a captain, and he's serving with the Duke of Cumberland, the son of King George II, is his aide-de-camp. And by 1749, in the same regiment of the 1st Foot Guards, he's already a lieutenant colonel. So he advanced quite rapidly through the ranks. I apologize, it's long distance. What was that? Oh, the overhead lights. Yeah, somebody want to? I'm sorry that I didn't know you couldn't read it. John, can we kill some of the lights? I might need a little for my up here, but otherwise, I didn't actually memorize all this, so I apologize. I wish I could. Just, oh yeah, not so good for me, but I guess good for you. Let me try this. I'm here. I'm in the dark. I'm back in my counterintelligence days. Okay. That bounty, is that acceptable? Oh, yeah, excellent. Okay, so moving ahead, I guess. So, did I cover everything on that? I think I did, didn't I? We were trying to change it. That kind of got me off track a little bit. Yeah. Okay, promotions. Here we go. So now I'm to 1757. The year he comes over. To give you the scenario on that, he leaves Portsmouth, England, to go to Cork, Ireland, on March 4th of 1757, and he's going to come over on the transports under the command of Admiral Francis Hulbert. Then he's going to arrive there on April 25th, and he'll leave Halifax in that fleet. They'll leave for Halifax in that fleet on May 8th. He'd arrive there on June 30th, and then he would leave soon after, and I don't unfortunately know exactly when. I couldn't find it, but he boarded the HMS Nightingale bound for Boston, Massachusetts, where he arrived on August 2nd. And then the following day after arriving there, he heads out to Fort Edward, and you all know where that is, to the south of us here. And he arrives there on August 6th during the siege of Fort William Henry up here. So he's with Colonel Monroe at Fort Edward, when Fort William Henry is under siege. He doesn't leave there. No one left there where it wouldn't allow anyone to come up. So what he did do while he was there, though, he went out with Webb, and he went out with an engineer, Colonel James Montresor, and they viewed the grounds around the fort's environs on both sides of the Hudson River, and they were looking for places to fortify better. And they came up with some ideas, and they decided on 18 pieces of artillery to defend the area, thinking, of course, I imagine that maybe Montcalm would continue down, which of course he didn't. So while spending the summer there at Fort Edward, however, he would afford himself the opportunity to go out with Captain Robert Rogers on a scout. And that scout went quite well in his, estimation. And that's where he started to learn and gather his own thoughts about wilderness warfare, which of course the British Army was still in the progress of trying to make adaptations to after the battle at Monongahela, when Braddock got hit by the Indians. That really woke the British up to their inefficiency in irregular warfare. So he went out, learned some things from Rogers, and it was right around that time too, incidentally, that Rogers Cadet Company was formed. That's when Loudon ordered him to do it, right around that same time. He then returned to Albany with Loudon, Webb, and Colonel Peter Scully with the New Jersey Blues on November 11th. 2 days later, however, he's sent to German Flats in the Mohawk Valley due to the fact that there was an impending French and Indian War attack there, or about to attack there. So he leaves Schenectady with a couple of regiments and with Captain John Bradstreet to assist in reinforcing the settlement. However, the French attacked it on the 12th, so they got there too late. And having arrived too late, they decide, okay, we're going to go back. And so they leave the German Flats on November 15th, arrive at Albany 2 days later on the 17th. And then he ends up going with the previously mentioned officers down to winter quarters in New York City on November 29th. He would remain in New York City for several months, but he'd leave for Albany again on February 3rd of 1758, where he again would meet with now Major Robert Rogers. He got promoted on April 12th, and it was during that time that they talked about more irregular warfare, and also this is the time that he's going to start making adaptations to the Army, which I'll refer to later. June 8th, he's back at Fort Edward, and he's readying the expedition for Fort Ticonderoga, and he'd leave for Lake George, where he would depart for Ticonderoga on July 5th. Now, according to legend, Captain John Stark, who's second in command of Rogers Rangers, he has supper with him up on Lake George on their way to Ticonderoga, and he goes to his tent, and they sit on a bearskin because Lord Howe didn't take a lot of camp furniture with him, and they discussed the battle coming up, and it was decided by Howe that he wanted the Rangers to take control of the bridge that went over what today is called, well, then too was called the River Lachute, which runs between Lake George and Lake Champlain. So the French had a bridge there and a sawmill there. He wanted them to take control of that once they got there. When they landed on their trip, when they were on the lake, I'm not going to go into the battle so much. I'll let John Eric do that later in the year when he comes and talks about it. But when they go up Lake George, it's a 6-mile long flotilla with whaleboats and with bateaux, and they land at this point, courtesy of Randy again. Randy provided this slide for me to show you the area. They landed in this area. This is where Lake George is ending and the River Lachute begins. And today that's known as Howe's Landing. So this is the area where the Army landed. Now, before discussing the incident that's about to occur, I want to talk a little about the adaptations. Now, this particular slide shows 3 different representations of the 55th Regiment of Foot, which was the one that Lord Howe is going to be commanding in this expedition. And it shows some of the adaptations that were made to the uniforms, and it applied to other elements of the Army as well, but this gives a good representation. They cut their coats shorter. The long tails are no longer there. He's actually removed lace off the uniforms. He's got the hats cut down. Instead of the tricorn, they're now cut to a 2.5-inch brim. And this gives you a pretty good representation of what he's now transforming them essentially into what would be like a light infantry unit, as opposed to the normal heavier stuff they would carry. Okay, next, there we go. Now, a woman named Anne McVicker Grant wrote a book called The Memoirs of an American Lady, and she was with the Schuyler's in Albany, good friend of theirs. And while Howe was in Albany, he actually was in the area, staying at times with the Howe or with the Schuyler's. Although he stayed with his unit overnight, he didn't leave. He never left his unit. Where other officers would go into town and maybe get a room in a tavern or something like that, and abandon their regiments, he stayed with his regiment. But these are some of the things I've already mentioned, actually a few of them, but these are all the things that she mentions in her book of different adaptations that he did make to the Army. And I'll let you just quickly scan those if you'd like. He even cut his hair. So normally back then, I'm not a hippie. I wear my hair long because officers, when I portray an officer in Roger Rangers, when I reenact, officers wore their hair in a long queue. He cut his hair off. He didn't wear the queue. So that was one thing he did that I didn't mention that's up there. And he had the soldiers cut their hair too. So there's a whole bunch of different things that were done that he did. And then in addition to that, that even got into the newspapers, not necessarily what she wrote, but other correspondents that observed what was going on. They wrote basically the same type of things. And these are from 2 issues of the Maryland Gazette that I cut out for you to see, but it's talking about primarily his adaptations he was making as well. So he's the first one on a large scale to really start to make these changes to help the Army become more adaptive to wilderness or irregular warfare. And now we get back to the unfortunate unfortunate death in all of our subjects. This is a painting that was done, published in a book, and depicting Lord Howe's death. After landing, what happened was the Army divided into 4 columns led by Howe toward Fort Ticonderoga, and then a French party was coming down from what today you know as Rogers Rock. Back then it was Mount Pelee, and they met in a meeting engagement. Some sources, as you'll see, will say it was an ambush. It wasn't an ambush. It was like Braddock's defeat. It was a meeting engagement. The two parties come upon each other suddenly, and then fair fight erupts. So here we see how batting the officer with the gorget, which he probably wouldn't have been wearing because Howe kind of said none of that stuff, but in this painting they put it there. The officer with the gorget in red, that would probably be Alexander Moneypenny, who I'll be speaking about. And then Gage's light infantry are the ones in brown. They were Thomas Gage's unit that he formed in 1758. They're the only British regiment not wearing red. As you can see, they're brown face brown. But that was, he formed them with the idea of trying to supplant Rogers Rangers, which never happened. But nonetheless, the caps they wore too were leather caps, and their nickname was Leather Caps. So that's what's depicted here. Then what happened was he gets killed running up to the front. He was very impetuous, and Israel Putnam tried to hold him back before it got to this stage, according to the legend. And he said, no, I'm basically said, no, I'm going forward. And he went forward and he paid the ultimate price for his doing so. And here are two accounts. One I didn't cut out, I just typed it out. The other one is an actual cutout from the New York Mercury, talking about his death and what happened. And the one that's the original one that I've got, that's where it talks about it being an ambush. And like I said, that's an error. But it's interesting because both accounts talk about Moneypenny. Moneypenny was his aide de camp. And Moneypenny, according to both, he was right there with Howe, and a French officer, these claim, shot Howe. And one account basically says he was offered the opportunity to surrender. The French officer decided not to, I guess, and Moneypenny shot him. So these are the accounts that discuss what happened there and how he dies. And here's some more details that were written by two officers, and again in the newspaper, but Hugh Arnott up there, a captain in Gage's light infantry, again, the brown uniform unit I just talked about. He said he was near him when he was shot, and as he advanced to the left flank, too boldly charging to the head of the light infantry, received a shot under the breast, which went through his lungs, his heart, backbone, so he died instantly. Moneypenny, who again was supposedly next to him, said he fell on his back, but he never moved, only his hands quivered for an instant. And then the Maryland Gazette, so here's a public account of his death, said that, again, it says an ambush, which is an error, but he was shot through the breast and died instantly. So these are the accounts we know of his death at the time it occurred, by two witnesses and then a newspaper account as well. Today, if you go up to Lake George, the other end of Lake George and up to the River Trout Brook, where he was killed, then called the Burnett's River, he has this, or they put up this sign about his death. You may have seen that before, but they say near this spot. Matter of fact, John Eric Nelson, that brings up a thought. John Eric Nelson played Lord Howe in battle we did up there at one time, and he played Lord Howe. And we did it near the location of this sign, and very dramatically he fell backwards. You can best his chops when he comes to talk to you about it. So now, talking about the bill, as many of you probably know, there's a controversy over where is he buried. I found some new information, which I'm going to divulge to you, that I think may clarify it a little better. But everybody can have their own belief in the end on where they think he might have been buried. But the controversy is based, as I say up here, at Ticonderoga and also down in Albany. So he's either buried Ticonderoga or he's either buried in Albany. Both are adamant that they have his burial. Uh, to me, one seems more likely than another. And as I say, uh, I'll give you some sources at the end if you're interested in things you can look up and read other accounts and things. So we'll start with the Ticonderoga argument. The Ticonderoga argument is that on October 3rd, 1889, some laborers were digging a sewer near the school, and they found a partially decayed coffin bones in this rock that I've illustrated here that's engraved Lord Howe killed Troutbrook. In memory, actually, it's a memory of Lord Howe killed Troutbrook. So right away, people got excited and thought, oh, we found Lord Howe's body due to the rock particularly. But one of the problems I have with the rock and others too, when you do the research, is Trout Brook wasn't called Trout Brook then. It was, like I said earlier, the Burnett's River. I have yet to see an original map that's labeled British map Trout Brook. It shows Trout Brook, but there's no nomenclature next to it. It's just graphic of the brook. The only thing I've seen of a map that shows Trout Brook is in Francis Parkman's Mein Common Wolf. And they made a engraving of one of the original plans, and they added the words Trout Brook where the brook is, but it's not on the original. So how there's also the argument that in that time period, Lord would be LD, not LO. That's usually how they would abbreviate it. Also, how they think they would have added the E to the end. Although back in that period, things were misspelled. They beg you will give it a proper burial, attended by yourself, the council, and the few principal inhabitants of New York City, and any sea or land officers that might be there, in the chancel of the English Church. But of course, the body never gets to New York; it just gets to Albany. And then again, Albany, what Abercromby wrote. So I kind of put them together so they marry up, if you will. Now here's where I found part of this is what I found, the bottom part, but the upper part has been published, is known that in the current church records, which is St. Peter's Episcopal Church in New York, but I mean in Albany, the records show that there was a payment made for ground to lay Lord Howe's body and the pall, and that's dated September 5th, 1758, for a total of £5.06. So that exists. Then what I found, and this shocked me, I found it totally by accident. I wasn't even looking for it. I was going through Law Office 34 papers, transcriptions of them, not the originals. And as I came to this one letter sent to General Amherst by James Napier, the director of the Albany Hospital, dated August 29th of 58, he said that he had spoke to Captain Moneypenny about the charges of Lord Howe's funeral, the account of which he desires may be sent to Captain Wilkins, paymaster of the 55th, who'll pay it. And that was John Wilkins. He's a member of his own regiment. So the regiment is willing to pay for his burial. This is 7 days apart from when that letter is written to when the entry is made in the church records. So my belief, having found that, is number one, I think the body is buried in Albany. Number two, if there were any funeral expenses, I can't imagine them if they were buried if he'd been buried at Ticonderoga. They would have just buried him in the field. What expenses would there have been? Plus, during that time in Ticonderoga, they were laying on their arms the night after that, after his death in that skirmish. And then the battle was the next day. I don't know when they would have really had an appropriate amount of time to try to bury him. But again, whatever your view is, I respect it, but that's my view for what it's worth. Okay. And in Albany, in the church, one of the things that's in there is this big plaque, which was commemorated on February 4th of 1914. I got all the information there. It's really large on the wall. Quite a nice little monument. And then on the floor, as you walk in, this is in the vestibule, both of these. And as you walk into the vestibule, right directly on the floor as you walk in, is this diamond-shaped plaque saying that he's buried beneath the pavement there in the church. And that's also, of course, where Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe was buried as well. I believe, by the way, that also brings to mind another person that I think was buried there as well, was probably Colonel Robert Townsend, or Roger Townsend, I mean, who was killed at Ticonderoga the following year in 1759 in Amherst's army. And then this picture, which I also have down here, again, courtesy of my friend Randy Padden, is a monument that was erected in Westminster Abbey. And what happened was Massachusetts actually allocated funds for that monument to be made, and I've put the information there about that as well. And they did that shortly after his death because he was so popular, both British and provincials. They really liked him a lot. And incidentally, there is a monument in Westminster Abbey for Wolfe as well. It's more elaborate, actually. Now, one thing that Fort Ticonderoga has is this pendant, and this pendant in the center there is a woven hair, and it's supposedly Lord Howe's hair, and it was supposed to have been presented to Chaplain John Ogilvy, who was the person who was in charge of the English church. He was the rector, and it says it is sweet and proper to die for one's country, although it's in Latin, but that's the translation. And they say that it was, let's see, country, I forgot. Sorry, John Ogilvy, chaplain of 55th. Yeah, they say in their records that he was in the 60th Regiment. Or in the 55th Regiment, I mean, Ogilvy, but he was actually chaplain also in the 60th Regiment of Foot of Royal Americans. So there were a lot of accolades that came out after his death and before his death too, actually. Here's a whole bunch of them by General Wolfe. He knew him. He was very much an admirer of him, and he lamented his loss. He also thought he was the best soldier in the Army, and he thought he'd be very instrumental, which he was, in changing or making adaptations to the Army. So he read a whole bunch of different things, and I've listed them all there. Okay, so there's also other accolades. There's also other accolades that were given by other people, and I listed them here to include Moneypenny, Robert Rogers, Abercromby. He said he really felt it most heavily. I imagine he did because he lost the battle. If Howe had survived, that may not have happened. The only saving grace for Abercrombie, if you want to call it that, was he sent John Bradstreet afterward out to take Fort Frontenac at Kingston, Ontario, and he was successful. Bradstreet, who's another officer I admire too, he took the fort, and so there was some victory in defeat, I guess you could say, but it was a small victory. The officer that's the New York Provincial Air, Woolsey, he's the one who actually calls Lord Howe the soul of the Army. And William Pitt, a character of ancient times, a complete model of military virtue. I mean, is that not a great accolade? So he was well respected, well liked. And there was a newspaper accolade that I cut out as well from the Boston Gazette. So there's limitless good words about Lord Howe. Not only were there good words about him in that respect, but they actually wrote 2 poems about him. This is one that's published. They also talked about Louisburg, because Louisburg fell just before, and so they combined it. But there's an ode to him here, and then the Scots magazine, which I have an original of this, actually has a poem to him as well. I didn't put that up there, but there were 2 poems dedicated to him as well. I promised you the select bibliography. This is a few sources. I didn't bring the book down. I meant to. I apologize. But the last one was recently published, as you can see, and it's all about the Howe family. So it talks about not just George, but it talks about William and Richard as well, and the whole family. The mother, Charlotte Howe, was very, very influential. And if you want to really get more into the Howe family, that would be a very good book. The other ones deal more with the topic about him at Ticonderoga, his death, and then his burial. So it'll give you all the different arguments that I didn't have time to go into, should you want to investigate further. And last but not least, there he is. So if you have any questions, I guess Bruce was going to come up. Hey, Bruce, I haven't seen you yet. Good to see you, Bruce.
Good to see you too, George.
Excellent.
I'm going to use this. I'll come to you and ask your question, and then I'll bring it back to George. But George, I haven't done lunch today because you have Julie Howe on there, and I just signed her up to be at a 13th annual conference on the American Revolution.
Oh, really?
Next year in Richmond, March 27th to the 29th. So Julie will be there. Anybody's interested. And there's some of you live at that conference. So, all right. Who has the first question? It's going to work.
Sure.
Feedback.
Yeah.
George, to your knowledge, did either of the brothers visit his gravesite in Albany?
Yes, according to what I've heard, William did come down to Ticonderoga, supposedly to see the gravesite. Randy Penn just told me that this morning. Actually, we were talking together for a while, and I'm gonna go back to Randy, if you don't mind, and I'll let him, because he knows more about that aspect. She asked, he was telling William Howe coming down to see his grave. So could you give a little more insight into that?
He did record that he came down to Ticonderoga looking for the grave of his brother, and that the fact that there were very few people that wrote about Howe's death at Ticonderoga. The silence was almost intentional, and played into the part that maybe he was secretly buried up there. And his brother came down through there, apparently made some inquiries as where his body was buried. Never found it, actually.
William, yes. The second oldest brother.
Yes. You said that how this plan, Rogers Rangers, what was that?
Oh no, you misinterpreted that. But it wasn't Howe that wanted to. Howe was 100%. Howe wasn't the one that did it. He was 100% behind Rogers. The person that was trying to supplant him was Thomas Gage with his light infantry. Remember those brown-coated figures I mentioned? He formed that in 1758, well, the end of 57 into 58, and he got permission to raise this light infantry company. It was 5 companies. It was smaller than usual, and they had the brown coats. But he didn't like Rogers. They didn't get along at all. And matter of fact, he was later more of a thorn in his side. But Yeah, he wanted to. Well, let me explain why. It wasn't just him either, but he was one of the shakers and movers. The British Army would be sending people out, be it provincials or be it regulars, but mostly provincials. And they didn't like the intelligence that was coming back because it would be disproven. Algiers was coming back with real intelligence, but some of these other people, they would leave Fort Edward, let's say, to go out on a scout. They might go 5-10 miles away, camp out in the woods because they were afraid to go all the way to Ticonderoga because had been ambushes. There were groups that were actually killed along the shores of Lake George throughout the war. And so they'd go a little ways out, then they'd come back and they'd give some erroneous intelligence. And the British caught on to it because when Rogers would say one thing and they'd say something else, they're saying, like, what's going on? So their feeling was, we'll need to send our own people, the British regulars, out to gather the intel because we can trust them. We can't trust these second-class citizens or whatever. So that was the motivating factor. And then Gage said, hey, I'll trying to promote himself, of course, I'll raise a regiment and I'll supplant them, we'll have a light infantry and everything will be good. So that was what it really was. Yep.
Couple of questions. Firstly, was this his first combat action in which he was killed? Like, he was in the army for a number of years, but was this his first combat action? And the second question is a little more deep. What do you attribute, after all your reading and research and everything, to his thought process of incorporating these new ways of fighting and these new tactics and being so open-minded to the provincials' way of doing things rather than all of his peers that seemed to be pretty staunch in their old school mindset?
But then the first question, he did see service during the Austrian succession or King George's War. Whether he was right in the midst of combat and in a dangerous situation, I have no record of that. And then, like I said, he did serve his aide de camp to the Duke of Cumberland, which of course was very influential to have that type of patronage, if you will. Regarding the second question, what made him basically make these adaptations? I think he had the personality and Wolf kind of, if some of them weren't Wolf wrote about, he had the personality and the insight, I'll say, to recognize that, okay, Braddock's defeat, as I mentioned, was a disaster. It was because they were going up against Native Americans. They didn't know how to fight them properly. They were using the linear tactics and the usual European-style warfare, which was not satisfactory against an irregular force. So when he comes over here after going out with Rogers in 57, I think that really was an enlightenment for him, from everything I can tell. And then when he meets with him again the next year when he's in Albany, Rogers writes in his journal that, I didn't put it in this lecture, but he basically writes in the journal he was well received. Lord Howe was behind him 100%. He became a patron. Unfortunately, it didn't live long enough to really have the influence, but he basically became a patron, and he saw the value, having been out with Rogers, that, hey, we gotta think about these things. Put leggings on our legs so when we're running through the woods, socks aren't cutting it. They're ripping our legs up, so we need leggings like the Indians were. We need to take all the shiny stuff off because then the gorge in it, it'll clatter against, make noise, noise discipline, like we talk about in the modern military, operational security, like we talk about it, go out there and not let the enemy know what we're doing, where we're going, and we're gathering intel on them. So all those things, I think Lord Howe had a very acute awareness. Let me put it that way. I think that would be the answer to your question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My question is about the letter or the military, the transcript. You saw the transcript. Where's the actual letter and how you spelled a little bit more background, how you spelled on it, and where is it now?
Okay. First, you're getting your exercise.
I know.
Oh,
Just rolled in from Concord, Massachusetts.
okay, that was a good place. So, the question I believe is, we're having a malfunction again here. So to answer your question, I think you're talking about the letter I found by the Napier to Amherst, right? That's the letter? Yeah. What happened was, well, I'm actually working on a book that is about the Mohawk River Valley and going west during the French and Indian War. And so I've been going through all kinds of documentation, looking for stuff on that and whatever else, because there's a period, if you haven't figured out already, I'm fascinated by it. It's my passion. So as I'm doing this, a friend of mine who's actually in the audience, he actually found the transcriptions of the War Office, or some of the transcriptions of the War Office 34 papers, which are in the queue in London. And this Canadian guy, I don't know who it was, but he went over there and he started transcribing a lot of these letters that pertain to Canada. He didn't do all of them, but we've been looking for these War Office documents for a long time. So without having to go over there, that is. So when he found these, I started looking through them myself. Then there was a section in there about the Albany Hospital and the doctors there and stuff like that. And lo and behold, I'm just reading this letter. And there's this paragraph suddenly just pops out. And it's what I put on the slide that, 55th Regiment, Lenny Penny says is willing to pay for the funeral or the funeral expenses. And I said, wow, this is brand new. I've never, ever seen it anywhere else. I don't know why anyone has ever seen it, but there it was. And it was like, knocked me out of my chair. I couldn't believe it when I found it. So yeah, it's a new revelation. So if you want to see it, you'd have to go over to the War Office papers or find that site on, which I don't know where it is on the internet, with the War Office papers that are transcribed from the guy in Canada. But yeah, that's how I found it. Totally by accident.
Question: in your research, did you come across any evidence of Lord Howe's strategy to capture Carillon, the taking of the fort itself, as compared to, say, what Abercromby wound up doing?
Well, pretty much outside of what I said, I'm sorry to say I'm not aware of any specific thing. The legend when he's with Stark the night before he's killed, he's talking about he wants the Rangers supposedly to take the bridge across the chute between Lake George and Ticonderoga. Nothing else comes to mind other than that. I'm not sure there are any written documents that laid out the plan. I think if there were, those would have been published long before this, and I'm not aware of them. Randy, just real quick, are you aware of any documentation about Howe's plans to take Ticonderoga? No, I'd go to him too, because he's pretty knowledgeable and he doesn't either. So I'd say I don't think anything exists.
Hey, Joe, Chris Cool.
Hey, Chris, good to see you, man.
Yeah, it just the reason that it was a bombing process afterwards, and I didn't think that process was approved right before the Civil War, because the first guy to be bombed supposedly was a guy from my hometown. I don't know where else was mechanic. So the first Union officer killed in the Civil War. But back then they had free travel, so it's so within days of his death, he was being put on the ground in Mechanicsville. And here it is, 1758, July. What sort of process was there back then, and who thought it was a good idea to transport a body in the height of the summer from Ticonderoga to what's downtown Albany? Who were the poor suckers that drew that? Any details on that, or how that would have been done back then? Dear.
Chris, you had to bring up a challenging question, didn't To be honest with you, when it comes to Lord Howe's body, how they potentially embalmed it, even superficially, I'll say, to get it to Albany and then plan to embalm it there further. I don't know what the processes were. I have to say I don't know. However, what I can say, well, before I go into that, I will talk about that. I'm just going to answer the other part of your question about whose idea it was. It was because, well, obviously Abercrombie mentions he sends it down for the purpose of trying to get it to his relations. And because of his stature, remember, he's a lord, he's a member of parliament at the same time he's a military officer. So he's a member of parliament at this time too. So he's not just a common officer, common soldier. He's way up there. He's elite, if you will. So that's the motivating factor, I believe, as opposed to somebody's bright idea. Now, when bombing, the only other thing I can even remotely tell you, I go back to my other hero, Wolfe. So Wolfe gets killed in Quebec, of course, in 1759. They take his body back to England, and he's buried in England. The way they did it, from everything I've been able to find, they actually put him in a cask of spirits. I don't know which spirit. I don't know, it wasn't Madeira because that's my favorite, but they put him in a cask. They put him in a cask of spirits, and that's how they got him back to England. Now, his body had the advantage of being laid on a river.
One more question. What's your opinion if Lord Howe had survived the French and Indian War and was alive during our revolution? What impact would he have had on our revolution?
You guys like to challenge.
You can dump this by saying I'm an historian. I feel counterfactual. It is
Or could I say I'm not into astrology? I don't know. Well, Andy, I know we've had that discussion. To be honest, I think it both Wolfe and Howe. I'll take them both if you don't mind, because they're so much alike in a lot of ways. If both of them had survived, I question whether we would have been successful, perhaps, in the American Revolution. I'll say too that William and Richard, the two brothers, when it became later, when the revolution is about to start, of course, they were meeting with Ben Franklin and can't remember his first name, Dean, I believe, Silas Dean, I believe it was. They were meeting together secretly, more or less, to try to avoid the Revolutionary War. It fell apart. But the historians believe that the Howe brothers weren't as motivated and successful against us as they could have been was due to the fact that Massachusetts had been that monument paid for it, and they had sympathy toward the colonies as a result of their honoring their brother. So, I mean, that's about the best I can kind of relate right now to that, I think.
They're also ways.
Yeah.
Well, I thought I'd share that I did some archaeology digging, one at the old glass factory in Albany, one in Winchester, England, and one for Colonel Buttrick in Concord, Mass, 60 years ago. And when I was in England, I learned about doing brass rubbings, which is right at the bottom, under the floor, and they put a brass plaque there. And these stone for Lord Howe was on the floor as you went into St. Peter's Church. The minister asked me to do a rub, which is rub. But I think I've read in the Times Union when they put it on the wall that they also found the coffin, opened it up, and he was in great condition, but air got to it and disintegrated immediately. So just to share that. And if you go into St. Peter's Church and where the altar is on the left, the rubbing that I did. So,
Oh, okay.
altar rub. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, what he had said was that he had taken a rubbing of that triangular plaque that was in the floor of the vestibule in St. Peter's, and it is on display over by the altar, he said.
Well, in other words, the plaque, Big Slings Dome, was designed by Mark B. Reynolds, who I think was a famous architect in Albany.
Yeah.
Was, I don't know, maybe in the 20s, 30s, 40s, I'm not sure what that was done. So that was on the fourth came in. Oh, but it was very different Anglican church. It was states. Oh, okay. And that's where he would have been buried. But I thought that, and then when they built the one that's there now, right, we're talking almost 100 years later. Right. But in other words, his body was interred underneath that.
Yep.
That slate stone. And then when they pulled it up, put it on the wall, they uncovered, I think, the coffin. And I think I've read the Time Union.
Yeah, interesting, because actually, just to give you a little insight too, the English church, as it was called, or what would have been an Anglican church, actually sat at State Street, right in the middle of the street. And so the church was, I had it written down, but I didn't present it. I apologize. The church was taken down, and they moved the church to originally the second one, I believe, the same site the current one is on. Is that right, Jack? Okay. Nice seeing you, Jack. Been a long time. And then his body was, or his bones, remains were reinterred at that time. And then when they built the current church, they were reinterred a third time, as I understand it. Is that right, Jack? Yeah, exactly. So, and I have to believe Monroe's would have been the same way. They don't even know about Townsend, I guess, but I'm sure Townsend was buried there as well. So yeah, his remains were actually reinterred, if you want to. They're reinterred twice, buried once, reinterred twice, yeah. Due to the movement of the church.
Want to tell me two more questions? So, in a book about General Stark by Moore, General Stark was recorded as saying that he was very conflicted at how had lived, and he would have had to fight him in the revolution. Very conflicted. And I think you're right, George. He probably wouldn't have won.
Yeah. I have no doubt Stark would have had a problem. Rogers would have had a problem. Although he ended up going to the Loyalist side, but that was due to circumstances that were beyond his control or something. Yeah, I think that would have been a different history lesson for sure.
In Hudson Falls, which was Sandy Hill at the time, there is a record of William Little Lee, who was a lawyer in Honolulu. He died there. He was shipped home in a lead-lined coffin filled with Hawaiian rum.
Okay, so it may have been Ralph Wolf went back in too. Yeah, which is better than Madeira. I hate to waste get Madeira.
Okay.
All right.
The next fall, George will be back for a lecture on 18th century embalming.